So we're going to follow the form of the first panel. So we will go through and have each participant just give a couple of sentences introducing themselves, and then they'll go in and give a full presentation about their work in relation to what we're discussing today. But first of all, I'd like to introduce Alexander Galloway, who's going to be our moderator. Alexander is a writer and computer programmer working on issues in philosophy, technology, and theories of mediation. Professor of Media Studies at New York University, he is the author of several books on digital media and critical theory, including most recently Laurel Against the Digital, Minnesota 2014, and The Interface Effect, Polity 2012. Also on the panel today, we have Florian Meisenberg, Kerstin Brätsch, and Ken Okiishi, and we're really thoroughly delighted to have all of you here today. So yeah, welcome.
Great, thank you. So thank you all for coming. So I think we'll just do maybe a very brief kind of self-introduction, all three of the panelists. And then we'll start with Ken, will be the first presenter today. So do you want to maybe just say a sentence?
I always feel a little bit weird introducing myself. So I'm Ken Okiishi, and I'm an artist. And I live in New York. I used to live a few blocks away.
I'm Kerstin Brätsch. I'm also an artist. I am actually born in Germany, but I'm living in New York since 10 years.
I'm Florian Meisenberg. I am an artist as well, and I moved from Düsseldorf to Bushwick in 2010.
That's the title of the show.
Great, so we'll begin with Ken's presentation.
Oh, there we go. We will. Okay. Projector's wiggling. Okay. So what I'm going to do today is attempt to be kind of straightforward. I have a tendency to wander off, so we'll see how this works. I'm presenting one project and one series of works coming out of a focus on the generative zones and limitations produced by the then, 2012, 2013, emerging relationships between the inside and outside of the touchscreen interface with the imagined and real worlds, simultaneously material and immaterial on different segmentations and continuously recalibrated feelings and sensations, and pathways of memory, storage, recall, and deletion, both loss and accumulation and speed and configurations of tension. The first project that I'm presenting was when I took an invitation from the Frieze Foundation to realize a project at the Frieze Art Fair in London. And I should preface this, which I'm sure everyone's like this, but I'm particularly allergic to the art fair context in this kind of primal scene kind of way, where it's always traumatic to witness all of these people fucking each other, basically. But my proposition for the experiment here was, and the curator there was really amazing, so she invited all kinds of things to happen. Nicola Lees is her name. Can a situation be incited by and in the fair itself where the dynamics of the fair are made palpable and or artistically generative, but also in relation to the confusion between inside and outside of the screen that is being in this zone of the fair, where the architectures and gloppy social interactions resemble or connect or even used to prefigure the sped-up networking kind of reshuffled in real life that is trying to be whole and fragmented at the same time, walking between booths as material data centers, like suddenly unzipped folders from a WeTransfer magically in real life. I think another idea is that the art fair is in really, 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 really high resolution. This is a video produced by the fair. I didn't write the voiceover either.
Enclosed within 4 perspex walls inside the Frieze project space at Frieze London, Ken Okiishi's commission adopts a paintballing technique to create a fun fair-inspired environment.
I don't like the voiceover
Drawing on Nikita
either.
files shooting pictures from the 60s, Okiishi's site-specific project includes paintball guns that can be activated remotely by the viewer to shoot colorful paint in random order against a number of small canvases hanging on the inner walls of the structure. Cameras are attached to 2 small robot vacuum cleaners inside the paintball room. While they're filming, they're also mopping a sort of mud on the floor as the colors come together and mix. The cameras link to a live stream channel that can be watched for the duration of the fair, offering a completely different point of view of the work to the audience.
Oh shit. That paint will go. Yeah.
The layers of colored paint gradually accumulate and generate a series of abstract paintings, which Okiishi removes from the chamber on the last day of the fair. The canvases thus continue to exist as images circulating beyond the installation, with their surfaces bearing the visual traces of a 5-day shooting range.
Okay, let's move forward. One of the other ideas was to create a kind of incitement of press.
This is paint your own painting, really, or paint your own Ken Okiishi. And it's all done with paintballs. I don't quite know how it works, but...
The other idea, one of the other ideas was that in kind of mirroring the screen itself, that it would create a kind of insatiable desire to Instagram. This was obviously before everything had an insatiable desire to be Instagrammed. My slideshow was on automatic for some reason. Okay. And so in that way, it also kind of creates, wait, there we go. How do we make this? Maybe that works. Where do we go from here? Oh yeah, in that way, it also creates these kind of globule paintings on the inside of the screen itself via the LED or LED screen colors. Another aspect of this project was that the works would then be smuggled with the Eurostar to FIAC. And we didn't have, it actually turned out the paintings were just the right size to fit inside of these little booth stand markers. And then the material of the paintball doesn't actually dry ever. It's kind of like a shampoo or something like that. So we use diapers to put the paintings inside of the... And the other thing is that the painting kept on dripping on the floor, which created a bit of a problem. These are the kind of products that were produced. And I'd like to contrast this with kind of very, I think there are 2 things that I'm now thinking back on this project into the present, is that this one kind of takes this situation that I was totally allergic to and tries to kind of use the dynamics of it to produce something generative that is hard to read whether it's a cynical or a sincere action. But at the same time, I kind of developed, let's go back to my notes. I developed another zone within the inside-outside of the screen that was a kind of private studio way of working. Here, the zone of the studio in uncompressed density, as in with the shifting relationships to approach and feeling and how the relationship to one's own content and formal appearances and frustrations and transcendences and collapses and narcoleptic fits of stress snapping approaches each screen as its own support surface, a hybrid surface that contains a density of affective potentialities and an idiosyncratic layering and compression of media histories. We can get more into that later. But what I'm showing here are kind of views from the studio of working this way, where I was using the individual screens as support surfaces for producing these paintings that are using oil paint in a slow way of looking while the screens are on, layering over time. And a lot of different things have been said about this, but I think the thing that I would like to recover now in this panel is the kind of air gap of the studio and the working in a way that allows a kind of density and complexity of private thoughts to emerge. Another thing that happened in this studio situation recently is that these kind of disconnected, isolated processes started to feed back into each other. And what that means is I would start filming one of the screens and then put that file into another screen and then film that again. That's it.
Thank you. Next up is Kerstin Brätsch.
So, I would like to read a short text. Hold on. Yeah. What's at hand? The lecture format is undeniably about submitting to language. You feel compelled to explain something about what you have been doing. So let's start with the Warhol maxim. Make your problem your solution. First solution, get someone you trust to write something. Speak it in your voice. Second solution, use language as the analogy by which to describe the paintings. What we already know is this. Language lives a parallel existence to what it describes. It can never be it, though it does often make that claim or gets mistaken for the experience itself. I know a dance critic who learned how to write her reviews by taking courses in literary translation. To move between French and English, for example, in her mind, is the same as moving from seeing a dance performance to writing about it. The loss must be accounted for by an awareness that any translation is, at best, an approximation. A written description of an artwork offers a map, rather than an experience of place. Think of sentences like clues, pointing towards the unspeakable. Think about different languages which come from different places. The voice on the inside versus what happens when it hits the surface and flows out of a mouth. A mother tongue versus a language used daily. How easy it is to make mistakes. How oftentimes those mistakes reveal more about the language than those who speak it fluently, who more or less no longer notice that they too are always translating as they speak from feeling or instinct into description. A flaw can summon the pun, joke, etymology, slang, origins, and unconscious connections. To get mixed up is a form of re-enchantment. So I begin staging the various layers that account for these new works, painting made using a marbling technique, the serious, unstable talismanic rendering. Firstly, there's the fact that I speak another language. I am always operating in various tongues, German and English. Secondly, consider painting a language. Consider craft another language. Consider how materials speak different languages. Paint is one language, glass is another language. Is a brush a tongue? Is a finger a voice? A drop of paint from a certain height makes a splash. Tools are words. English speakers have marveled at my misuse of English. The most generative in this case is when I called the marbling paintings my marbles. What did I accidentally unleash? It took a native speaker to let me know how funny she found this. Marbles being an expression of sanity or anger, to lose one's marbles. It can also mean something like good stuff, less commonly used if one picks up a prize, to collect one's marbles. It comes from a child's game of marbles, little glass balls which are thrown around and scored in various configurations. The previous body of work I made was the glass project, Maler den Pinsel prüfend, or the glasses, as I also wrongly call them. The glass before the painting, to spell out one's own name, to put a spell on, the new spelling. During this period, in 2011 and 12, I transformed myself into a neophyte, someone who must speak or communicate my works into existence through a glass workshop and its staff. Brushstrokes. Single brushstrokes in stained glass. Brushstroke as candy, brushstroke as dunk. Brushstrokes not only as a signature imitated and sculpted by the glassman, but a placeholder, an active reaction to painting from the inside out, starting with the fundamental building block. First tool, the primordial brushstroke, and even before that, optic foundation, pre-painting, light rays, refraction, surface transmission. What is a sculpted brushstroke? A sculpted signature, a sculpted hand. The glassman as the extension of my hand, who is intuiting himself by simultaneously interpreting my hand, a scientific mathematical translation of my gut. Blocked radiance, abstract anxiety, radiation. Friends, mysterious finger, shown, appeared, chasing away the faults. Purity, double identity, the eyes, two equal points of view. His eyes looked at me, double and sufficient, already claimed by absence and the gulf. To bring everything together here? Transfusion, change in the manner of being, that's all. Myself, perhaps the ambiguity, this can be, with the result that purity emerges from corruption. Sigis Erben. Agates like sampling, a stone formation, creatures or characters just like my psychic paintings. A brushstroke made out of agate shards. Sigmar Polke's leftover from his stained glass window project at Großmünster, Zurich. Sigmar Polke's heritage, Sigmar Polke's trash. Sunshields, recall painting, pre-state painting, flexible positions, protection to be able to look into high-density rays of the sun. Fukushima, the eye is built on friendship. United Brothers counts on them. United Brothers Tanning Salon in Iwaki, Fukushima, Japan. Iwaki Odori Parade. Nakoso Beach. Man made fire by the sea and discovered glass by accidentally melting sand. Bring the glass back to the sea. Fuji Mountain, a volcano, the highest point in Japan towards the sun. A volcano is also made out of glass, lava. Antique glasses. Brushstroke as mask. Brushstrokes as masks. By this chain of language, you can see how the current body of work was embedded in the last one without me being entirely conscious of it. In this case, language provided the fluid clue, a sort of code about where to go next, after the glass. The marbling paintings were therefore encased in the glassworks, just like a little glass marble. I described the marblings as being made by dropping a drop of ink from high. The height determines the width of the mark. So the description known is also the verb, to drop a drop. A raindrop functions in the same way, and a teardrop. Are they voluntary or involuntary? How much is marked? Oh, how much is instinct? How much is a ready-made drop? I imitate drops, and I drop the glass marble. I shatter the glass, so to say, into a marbling technique. Here's a good moment to interject and explain the fact that I frequently use the expression so to say, or at least I'm told I do this. I'm not so aware of it. But a friend sees it as evidence of my unconscious mistrust of language. So to say, or so to speak, as in, watch me now as I make a metaphor and let me highlight the fact that I'm describing something in an unusual way. This isn't exactly what I'm describing, so suspend your expectation and shift it towards this new proposed description, this unnatural one. The online dictionary provides the example of this expression's usage. Delving into the body's secret, I look death into the face, so to speak. I want to break apart the brushstroke, so it's only naturally that to shatter it, I must drop it. And so to drop it, I must literally drop a drop of paint. This shattering produces a brushstroke out of a destructive impulse. It undoes the hand by involving gravity. The micro-touch versus the macro-universe. My hand is still working, but in connection with elemental forces. When one drops something, the effect is shattering, and to use the language of dropping, I might also be dropping boundaries, genres, expectations, limits, history. I'm also dropping down, going low, breaking the boundary between high and low, between painting and craft. I'm moving between them. I'm drawn to the occult power of the misunderstood. Craft is a language different to painting. I exaggerate craft, and I'm not very versed in the language very deeply. I import foreign hands, in this case those of the German paper marbler Dirk Lange. Unstable talismanic renderings need to be made by 4 hands, 2 of an artist and 2 of a craftsman. One cannot pick up the paper alone. The wall is useless to this process. The painting is made inside a basin filled with water, a sort of analog flatbed scanner. Dramatically oversized, they loom like ambient projections of smaller fetish pages. Talisman monster mocking the amulet, only to become a haunted specter itself. To import, a verb used by das Institut, an import-export agency, the agency to import or to speak another language with limited knowledge. In doing so, I can perhaps bring out the unconscious power of craft by determining it within a painter's language. I'm mistranslating the concerns of craft as they become known to us. The talismanic is unstable. How else to explain the ways it takes on a life on its own? Hyper-real details transform solvents and dyes into characters, reminiscent of anime, cartoons, insect, wild-eyed and breathing, alchemy or witchcraft seems suddenly the only explanation behind these creations. Painting as pot stirring. Like voodoo or candomblé, the same random drop that creates chaos can create order, the order of another existence. From the margins to the center and back again, fluidly. One drop produces a creature in an alternative cosmos. Simultaneous planes of existence interface. We cannot enter into the other entirely, but exchange only glimpses. Parallel existences feed off each other like the parasites who have evolved to survive of the blood of a mammal, whose very existence they are not yet aware of, but wait without waiting for it to walk by. So the eyes, assholes, belly buttons, voids, mouths, holes, hairy edges, antennae, and all other parts ramble along the paper with and without purpose. They could be from deep space or deep underwater. Both miasmas we normally need machinery to see into. Now, think about the associations of marble, the hallowed material of monuments and Renaissance sculpture, purity. Italian white marbles, austere high culture. Abi Warburg's Mnemosyne Atlas. It was in the Warburg Institute in London, actually, where I first saw some small-sized paper marblings on the wall. They were delicate and used as passepartout frames for Xeroxed images from Warhol's collection. It occurs to me that the craft of marbling paper was developed principally to use as a backdrop for words, starting with official documents in 15th century Japan to protect them from forgery, and for poems, as the dreamy irregularity seems to suit and warn readers of poetry's unconventional and magical placement of words to gain sense. Later it went via Turkey and Hebrew marbling and the Middle East to Europe and became most highly recognizable as the front and back covers within books and papers, as they are commonly known. Front and back, standing before and after language, offering a visual equivalent of the origins myth, cosmic soup, gray matter, an effervescent mix of thoughts and feelings that remain undifferentiated, and only through which the strict and careful crafting of language can any of these elements be distinguished, be laid down neatly, separately, in black press on white pages, turned into ideas. The marbling inside the covers of books staged the chaos of our minds and interiors, setting up a non-verbal blast so that the words which follow will look especially clear and descends back into chaos once the word ends. Logos rules. The marblings have offered a glimpse into the other territories of our existence. They are also patterned and fractal, like nature. They seem sometimes to have logic. They might repeat like a film sequence, but each marbling paper comes out differently, despite the same technique, so we perceive them as timeless. The structure of the book offers comforts to the formlessness of lived experience, but it's necessary to have the marbling paper in there too, small decorative emblems of our true nature, which by inversion hints at how constructed language is. In an echo of that structure, in this lecture, images are end papers, and these words that I speak are a small offering, a parallel movement that dips in and out of language like a whale in a current, playful and heavy. What is my problem? The language of painting. How to describe the limits of languages when it comes to visual sensation. What is my solution? Use the language of painting, all the languages, not only one. Describe painting as a language itself. Show how language mistakes, mix-up, mutinous, a paranoia of speaking about it, and misunderstanding are all valid ways to speak about painting. Shared root words, sometimes connected properly, sometimes pure coincidence, create a network of meaning. Craft dissolves the I, questions the voice. Use four hands, use another voice. Play it back, like hearing my voice on a voicemail. The appeal of each marbling being unique contradiction because it's made with a technique. So subjectivity is undermined by material and process. Through it would seem to speak over and beyond them personal. Cloud and wind, smoke, floating, elemental body, blowing, comb, touch. Thank you.
Thank you, and Florian will be the third speaker.
Oh shit. I decided to exemplarily show images of a show or one of my recent projects, which was taking place at Simon Subal Gallery, not far from here, in this year in March. And the title of the show was "Delivery to the following recipients failed permanently." Entering the exhibition space, one would have but no choice to step directly on the fragment of a blue tennis court dividing the space of the gallery, but also connecting the different parameters of the show with each other. As there were chairs, freed by heat treatment from their generic lawn chair existence, and released into the freedom of a new animated, eccentric melancholia. They actually occupied the whole space. We see just now one of them. The painting we see here comprised of 3 panels forming a triptych, together about 21 feet wide. I'm a metric person, so that took me some time to figure. And slowly but gradually shrinking to the right side, what you can see here. It shrunk so subtle that when you were actually in the space, you were not really immediately noticing it. Just a weird feeling of, or disturbance of, that something was wrong with perspective, or with that perception, or with your perception of that perspective. It depicted a seemingly peaceful and loose structure of almost randomly floating SIM cards, which I hope you can see here a little bit. The colorful dots, of all sizes, oil-stained ghostly imprints of my popo, butt, and white monosilk screen prints of physical stock image curtains from the dollar store, mostly. And ominous players or users in the form of different colored vertical lines of oil paint directly out of the tube, which we have here. The next, and there too. Resembling floating ice or abstract diagrams, persisting on some sort of singularity, possibly deriving from the different amount of grease or oil staining around them emanated from the paint, and the dotted line loosely, I hope you can see it, mapping some sort of triangular potential. The live render fluid simulation I developed in collaboration with Harvestworks was occupying the main axis of that show. Each screen of painted plexiglass on either end of the gallery depicted a dark animated liquid that floats in front of a self-designed skybox. I don't know if any of you is familiar with the concept of skyboxes, but it's an interesting topic in relation to the panel, but also in relation to painting as such. It comes from the computer sphere or computer gaming sphere, and we might go back to these concepts of skyboxes later, but up to now, just for your information, these backgrounds were self-designed skyboxes. Backdropping black and white historic scenes in a zero-gravity atmosphere. Now I'd like to... There's another angle of the 2 screens facing each other in the space, and I'd like to show you the documentation of that program. We connected the program, or the blobs, how we called them, with several 3D free-to-share open platforms or databases, mostly of universities, or the NASA has, or NASA, I don't know how you call it, has a free-to-share and 3D website or database, and those liquids searched those databases actively and live for 3D models created by thousands of users all over the planet. To download them and randomly and integrate them into the stages, to finally, after that short dance we will see in a little while, absorb them. So all these objects you see rotating into the scene or rotating into the program are objects which the liquid in this moment just randomly pulled from one of these databases. Furthermore, we programmed the liquids, because there were 2 of them, as you saw before, to know of each other's activity, meaning that they would constantly influence each other in their choice. So if one liquid was, for instance, downloading a car, or like a red car, or the 3D model of a red car, there was an increased chance that the other liquid would download something of a similar shape out of the same or similar category to absorb it as well. And this connection between those two blobs caused a kind of hyper-synchronized mimesis between the two of the blobs, which was and still is endlessly fed by new models constantly uploaded to these databases. So the program or the data banks are under permanent fluxes because all the time new objects are uploaded. So the program will refer or download to also these newly created or uploaded models. Generally, my artistic approach derived from painting, but I'm simultaneously intrigued and engaged with the digital sphere and all its simulations. Oil paint, for me, literally and pathetically represents human substance, not only as a concept, but within the history of being and becoming. Historically, oil paint was invented to imitate the haptic and albedo of the human skin in early portrait paintings, and for me it never lost this reference. This proximity to ourselves enables the medium painting to summon an incredible gravity, which rejoins with the infantile energy subscribed into the memories of our first attempts to communicate. So in my painting practice, I attempt to utilize all fundamental capacities of the medium painting in its full spectrum, as painting appears to me as the ultimate human agent to evaluate and test contemporary conditions and phenomena, with a focus on the virtual and the digital sphere. That was someone coming to the gallery, trying to enter the gallery. In the digital sphere, I'm specifically fascinated by the idea of the internet as an ultra-collaborative machine, and I'm interested to explore and reveal existing, but also to create new utopian architectures of collaboration. Further, in my installations, I tend to set up a sort of experimental testing ground, a kind of hybrid space dislocated between the digital and the analog, to have them stare at each other, to threaten each other, to collide and to intertwine, to see how data or images are altered, oscillating between the spheres, and to observe and determine which features become obsolete or increasingly more meaningful. So this is my contribution for the introduction. Oh, I can just sit here, but I need some.
Oh, you do.
Great, thank you. Thanks to all three of our presenters today. I'm not an artist and I'm not a curator. I'm sort of, I don't know, a casual observer perhaps from the edges or from outside of the art world. I don't think I'd go so far as to say, like Josh Smith said, that I'm on the wrong panel, but I'm certainly maybe coming from a slightly different perspective. And so I'll if you'll indulge me, I just want to say a few things about the digital and about digitality, and something which I think I know something about, and then I'll say a few things about abstraction, which I'm sure I don't know a lot about. And then I will sort of, pitch questions and prompts and throw out words and ideas, in the hopes of hearing more from our three panelists here. So in some senses, we've actually not seen a lot of digitality at all in any of these three presentations, maybe a little bit in Florian's material that he just showed. Is that true? I think in some ways yes, and in some ways no. The digital means a lot of different things, that's for sure. We can talk maybe, small, medium, and large or something. In a large sense, I think we could talk about the digital condition, digital culture, a kind of digital environment that we all live in some level. Photoshop and Instagram are part of the daily life, daily studio practice, I would bet, for a lot of artists. And so this would also encompass things like post-internet culture, social media, Web 2.0, but also a kind of digital infrastructure. I know that some of the artists are going to want to talk about distribution, ease of access, a kind of distributed or rhizomatic infrastructure that I think has significantly changed our lives. So that's maybe at the kind of the large level. At the medium level, we could drill down and speak less about the digital in a colloquial sense and more maybe in a kind of particular dictionary definition type sense. And here, the digital really has to do with a form of representation that is based on discontinuity or based on breaks, based on discrete points, based on periodic processes of sampling that have gaps in between. So I think this is one reason why we talk about something like zeros and ones when we talk about the digital. But I don't think there's anything maybe special about zeros and ones. And certainly something like the alphabet is the original kind of killer app of digitality, breaking down all forms of human speech and all of the complicated phonemes and sounds that our mouths can make into a discrete number of letters. There's no A, B, B and a half or something, right? So it's about breaking things down into discrete units. So in that sense, I'll throw one little kind of side comment out, which is that for me, digitality is as old as time. And this myth that that digitality is this kind of late 20th century invention is something that we should, I think, maybe throw out. So then in the smallest sense, I think the digital should be understood as a process of distinction, as a process of division, of difference even, a process of making discrete. And again, I just want to emphasize that we don't necessarily need to discuss all of these different levels. And I'll probably want to, my first question will probably want to be about this general level of the digital condition, and whether we get down into the low-level stuff, that may not be that important. So that's a little bit about the digital. About abstraction, we heard, if you were at the earlier panel, I think Maria Lind did a great job sort of giving us a sense of a variety of different, it's a really complicated term. And I come out of this kind of critical theory background where, abstraction is like the enemy or something, right? Not abstraction in art, but abstraction in terms of like the history of philosophy, the history of political theory, the distinction between idea and matter. So I've been really kind of wrestling with this, but Maria mentioned the idea of a kind of departure from realistic representation, figuration. We could talk also about the realm of idea and concept. I think also abstraction has a special relationship to spirituality and in fact to consciousness, right? And maybe I'll say a little bit more about that later. Also the idea of being isolated from context. So we talk about something in the abstract, right? So that's also part of it. Two other things I'll add. One is the notion of translation. So Maria already mentioned abstraction as a sense of like dragging or drawing away. So when you abstract something, you draw it out or draw it away. So we could talk about translation, that as an act of translation. But then curiously, it seems like it's really translation of a certain sort. It's translation often as reduction. So we talk about abstraction as reduction to, pure form. You can think of the idea of a mathematical equation or a mathematical concept as a kind of reduction of the complex messiness of the real world phenomena of some kind. And I was trying to think earlier, whether we could think about abstraction in the opposite sense, not as reduction, but as some sort of, proliferation or something. And I think that's also the case. Okay, so that's some kind of opening remarks. I think maybe the best place to start is, and maybe, I'll want to pose the question of the digital in a second, but maybe the best place we can start is actually with painting. So I'll just throw that out maybe to all three panelists, maybe first to Ken and Florian. I want to hear more about your relationship to painting. Obviously, you both have a special relationship to painting. Ken, you seem like you really want to get things messy and dirty in both of those kind of bodies of works that you showed us. Florian, you said that painting is a kind of a test, and I'd love to hear more about what you mean by that. Or even we could connect it to the first panel and the question about gesture and action, painting as a kind of, as something that requires the physical body, requires time. So maybe I'll open it up to Ken and Florian first, if you have thoughts about that.
You want to start?
Okay. I'm someone who has to really define my terms, or I can't say anything. So I think that for me, I need to first define the term gesture. For me, gesture comes specifically out of a history of abstract painting. My favorite of the abstract expressionists is someone who's actually very young on the scene of the first generation of abstract expressionists. I think it's called a second generation, but she was just like younger at the same time, who is Joan Mitchell. And for her, the working out of drawing out of real forms, so kind of working through a kind of just previous history of modernist painting, looking at Picasso, coming out of Cubism, etc., led to a way of opening up the line of the form into a zone where, and this is my own interpretation, just so if someone wants to disagree with me, please go ahead, into a zone where you can kind of transmit, for example, the feeling of the landscape or the feeling of a specific kind of place into an experience of a painting where that feeling is transmitted but not through the representation of the outside line of the object. So for me, gesture collides in the present moment with the kinds of, it started as a kind of halfway joke of like the way the finger grease is left on the surface of the touch screen. And I liked the kind of colors that happened when that happened. And then, I was also thinking about the ways in which, this surface becomes a kind of, both transmits light out and becomes a kind of like control center. That those relationships could become worked out and developed into some sort of form that speaks on an abstract level. And I think also within the first panel, the definition of abstraction that I would most agree with was the one from Mondrian, that it creates, intensification rather than simplification. That it collides, that it brings together an intensity of I guess I would say transmission. And that it also, I guess the other thing for me, my specific relationship to painting in my work, I think I would define painting as something that can only be experienced in one place, meaning something that you can photograph, that you can see images of, blah, 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 blah. But for me, the specific characteristic of a painting is that it only really happens when you're directly in front of that specific thing in the world.
That's a nice last, comment, because I think it kind of neatly fits to what I wanted to say or respond to that question. Again, I think that I'm a painter, really in the deep inner side of me, studying in Düsseldorf in the academy in the class of Peter Doig. Will give you a little insight from where I came, kind of. And I think what you mentioned about the physicality or the necessity of physicality of experiencing a painting is something I'm all the time engaged with or fascinated by, and started thinking of what is that fascination of painting, or which is emanated by a painting as such. and trying to understand it myself. And I came across that analogy kind of quite recently when there was this big discussion about Philip Seymour Hoffman being, like it was when they were filming the Hunger Games, and he, in the last, I think, part of the trilogy, he died just before the last most important scenes of the trilogy. And they were discussing, the production team and the director, if they would decide to recreate him as a computer-generated model, CGI. And in the end, like after a long discussion, also out of respect for the family, they decided to not do it, out of respect for the family, but also out of respect for him. And that brought me or presented me that allegory. I try to explain to you now, thinking of the difference between appearances and phenomena in the digital sphere, but also in the physical or real space. And I had to think about the wrinkles on the forehead, for instance, or around the eyes of Philip Seymour Hoffman, the actual Philip Seymour Hoffman, and what caused those wrinkles to look and behave like they were doing on his face was actually the addition of his entire life experience, and including all the emotional moments he went through and his facial expressions accordingly reacting to those. So that's something like the way his face or our physiognomy in general, more abstractly, is shaped, has something, was very closely related to a long, like very complex and intimate process of material which is shaped due to the course of time and Jesus and the events we go through. So going a step further, trying to put it into words, I would say that this symbolizes, or like the essence of that analogy would be for me the necessity of the symbiosis of an appearance with meaning somehow, with an inner necessity, which I ascribe to the actual folds on the forehead of Philip Seymour Hoffman, but and which then made me think of painting, because I ascribe the same quality to the medium of painting, being able to shape folds, if you want to say so, on the canvas, trying to distinguish the difference. But on the other hand, it's something almost completely absent or only existing under different circumstances in the digital sphere, like, and to compare those, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, something that comes out, I think in a lot of this work is also the question of layering. And I think of layering also as a kind of, I don't know, digital technique, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's about the superimposition of potentially very different elements, something that Oehlen does, I think, quite well. But I want to hear from Kerstin as well. I know that this, what's your relationship to painting is such a large question. But one thing that came out in your presentation, I think you said something like that your new work is sort of embedded in the old. And I see a lot of, I think, kind of continuity, even thematically and aesthetically. So maybe, do you want to expand on that? I mean, I like your use of, your work brings out a lot of things for me, the use of organic shapes, your treatment of color. I think your use of accent and contrasting color, I think is although you've stopped using black, which I'm really disappointed about. So I don't know, maybe you want to talk about color. Translucency is a huge thing in your work, maybe something that you do, I think, more than other artists, maybe. So can you say more about that?
God, so many questions. But first, is this on? Sounds so. Yeah? Okay. First thing I would like to say is that this text, which I was presenting in my voice, was not written by myself, but by my friend and colleague Alison Katz. So this stands already kind of like as a good example of like probably my entire approach as an artist. So the question was like, how can painting be relational? And maybe this question of like, translucency or like light in general. In discussion with Alison, obviously, like how she wrote it in my voice it was actually also for a lecture, but I mean, all this probably doesn't matter. But the question in general for me was like, so how, if can painting be relational, and can painting have a body, whether it's like social, psychological, physical, and that obviously raises several questions, like can it be liminal? And if it's liminal, it's depending on light, so can it be a screen? And then again, that in relation to like the virtual space. So going back, because I'm trying to think, like answer all your questions, but like going back to the question, like if painting is depending on light, what happens if I almost like contaminate it with light? And that was the project my friend Adele Röder and I, as this institute, did with United Brothers, who is Hayakawa sitting right in front of us, and his brother Tomo. So basically the idea was contaminating painting with artificial light, and artificial light being the tanning solar light, and that being the imitation of the sun. So, and that referring to the work I've done on the material mylar, which is basically like painting with oil paint with a traditional medium on a material which is always liminal, because it is, it reflects back, it shows like every traces and like failures and hair and fingerprints, but also reflects the viewer back. And then anyway, so like the linguistic logic in this text was also based on like what literally happened in my practice, was like painting on paper, then going towards paper, or like paper in space, like painting in an architectural relationship, and then literally having the painting being a screen, or like interchangeable and like always in flux, or like being a performance background, and then going into this idea of like contaminating it, or like putting a stress test onto it, basically. And then I asked myself the question, like, what if light is the topic, so to say, the theme? What if I look for something which only exists is so depending on light that otherwise it wouldn't exist, and that is basically stained glass. So going back to the question of color, the glass obviously is so depending on sunlight, because otherwise it's just dead matter. And I really like this contradiction idea of like, it can be dead matter, but at the same time it also only exists as being liminal, like the glass is between the viewer and the world, and a painting is like reflecting back, but the glass is really like literally, in between.
So
and
there's,
also,
it seems that forces a kind of spatial dimension, because I know a lot of your work comes off the wall in ways that aren't really installation, or maybe kind of.
And like going back to the question of like color or black, I don't know what you meant with like, I don't use black, but black in glass, for example, doesn't exist. There is no such thing as black glass, and my usage of black is always an accumulation of other colors, so that creates blackness. So, but then the question is more like, is black a color, or is it more like a shade, or
Excellent. So maybe we could talk a little bit about digitality. This is really just a question for all three of you. Back to the idea of a kind of digital condition or a digital context. I think if we go off of the definition of digitality that I offered at the beginning, digitality is abstraction, right? Because if digitality is about breaking things and reducing them to discrete elements, then I think we have to register that fact, that digitality is abstraction. So what is your relationship? Do you think of yourself as working in the context of the digital? Do you think of yourself as making digital art? Ken, you showed us some robots. You showed us screens, right? Florian, you talked about this kind of technology of the skybox, which is used to create 3D worlds. So yeah, I'll just open that up. I don't know who wants to go first. Ken, maybe you want to go first?
I guess I always have to start. Okay, so there are. Whoa, this is very loud. Is this better? Okay. I tend to want to go very close. I think there are. I would disagree with your definition of digitality in terms of zeros and ones being related to the alphabet in the same way. And I guess what I would like to put forward is two things that I am hopefully remembering correctly because they just appeared in my brain. From Friedrich Kittler's kind of, and of course it's Kittler, so it's like, it's not necessarily true. But there are two moments in his kind of history of writing, or kind of like in his, like from his later book, Musik und Mathematik, that vowels emerged in order to transcribe the poetry of the Odyssey, meaning in order to transcribe the sounds that were made. And then another thing I would like to kind of bring forward is that spaces between words emerged in writing because people were reading languages that they had never heard, right? So in that way, I think that the zeros and ones of digitality, right, meaning computers or whatever you want to call it, the thing that allows data to be transmitted is a different kind of thing than, someone talking and writing down through letters, through phonetic. That was when he's kind of trying to figure out or make up how it is that, phonetic alphabets emerge. So in that way, I think there is, with language and phonetic alphabets, there's a relationship to kind of lyricism and the body and erotics that I think, at least in my own work, I would like, it's kind of a simultaneity for me with the, and it's terrible because, you show an image of something and like you can't see it. But in the actual work, when you're confronted with both the kind of material of the pigment and the paint, and the screen image at the same time, you have two different modes of basically like interacting with light at the same time. One of them is digitally produced, and the other one is not.
This time I can't connect to your, but I think that. The concept of skybox, I don't know if it is the right moment to get into that, but I think generally, or more generally, that for me also there's a significant difference, or like almost like a kind of void, or like in between the digital and the analog. And for me, it is like painting, which is that representation mostly, or like I called it, agent of that analog sphere, or like more precisely maybe the human agent I'm working with in the terms of creative process by trying to convey images. And I don't feel that I'm an abstract painter, but I kind of engage with the medium painting as such. So this is something I can relate to Kerstin, which when you said that painting as such is a language and not abstraction, or so I have the feeling that I'm also trying, and I don't know, like I'm trying at least to incorporate or engage with all sorts of approaches towards painting, going back in, I don't know how far. So I incorporate those different aspects and elements in order to create the perfect human agent, so to say, to evaluate not only the digital sphere, but also like contemporary phenomena, wide ranged, I don't know, or conditions or symptoms we talked about earlier, contemporary symptoms. I don't know, like doing this, or like I think that really the installations are that kind of testing ground, or the laboratory where these tests, I'm running these tests somehow, and I come across all sorts of different observations, like, I mean, maybe the fault, which I mentioned, or another one, and this is something where I can kind of see the digital becoming abstract somehow, is because for me it is not abstract at all, it's a kind of the opposite almost, but following the instantaneity or insanity of the speed of sharing information, it is just so much and incomprehensible that it becomes abstract through the amount and intensity of it being shared and liked and and sent back, or basically the incredible up and download speed somehow of us being part of the network. And this leads to another observation maybe I want to drop in here, which is because of that speed of sharing information, mainly images, I would say, because we are so attracted to images and Instagram and Facebook, kind of. There's a phenomena I would call like the jet lag of meaning, because of the instantaneity or like the speed of sharing images, and we like them but we forget them in the same moment. There is almost no time, and we don't want time actually to try to comprehend them, having them processing deeper into our mind or conscious or in another form. So there's this, that phenomena I'm part of somehow, or like I have to face myself.
So maybe I'll ask one final question, then we can open it up to some questions from all of you here. I wanted to go to a quote from a book that I don't know, I spent some time with that I think has helped me understand what abstraction means. It's Michel Henry, the French phenomenologist Michel Henry's book on Kandinsky. And in that book, he wrote that abstract painting defines the essence of all painting, and we could dispute that, I guess. And I think the point here is that, and this was mentioned in the first panel too, that all painting abstracts the visible world, and we might even just say, I don't know, all thinking, all of human endeavor abstracts the world in some level. But I think even beyond that, it's a point about not so much the visible world, but also the invisible world. And for Michel Henry, this is like the essence of Kandinsky, right? So things not already seen, things like feelings, concepts, forms, and for Kandinsky, of course, spirit and the spiritual. Kerstin, you mentioned, I think, you mentioned the occult power. So I'm really interested in abstraction and the relationship to the spiritual, the mystical, which comes up in a lot of this work, the occult, the esoteric. So the question, I guess, is, do you see your work as a kind of spiritual undertaking, however you want to define that? I don't know, Kerstin, do you want to say more about the mystical or the occult? And I guess by, I don't mean to bring up the topic of religion so much as really the human, right? Because I think the spiritual is in some ways code word for us.
Yeah. It's just kind of like hard to define that with language. That's why I'm like a little... Wow.
Are you inspired by I don't know, mysticism or any kind of spiritual writing or spiritualism in art?
Not so literally. I think it's more... I think the question is also like, how can you... how can you unform your hand, so to say? Like, how can you undo your signature and involve... I mean, the marblings, for example, was the question of, like, how can I collaborate with, like, more universal forms, like, and the glass is, like, say, the question of, like, from a brushstroke, which is a signature from a painter's hand, to translate that into another material and give it form, and it's at the same time it's form, but it's also pattern, so it's figuration and abstraction at the same time. So how can I undo that? By involving gravity, for example, in the marblings, like dropping a drop, cohesion, adhesion, and how do I involve chance into the practice? But then at the same time, how can I bring subjectivity back into a collaboration with chance? So whether to call that mysticism or like mystical, I don't know, because it's basically like trying to include something in your questioning or investigation or into your practice, which is the unknown, or like you called it the occult, or I wouldn't say religious or like religion. It's very hierarchical. So maybe it's more like the idea of like having something non-hierarchical or more fluid, like fluid.
Can I add something? Because don't want to interrupt you, but just I had in the previous panel, I think the topic of religion popped also up kind of, and I think Josh said that for him the artist or like art is religion somehow, and I just want to know, kind of because I noted or wrote it down, wanted to make a distinction for me, because I also don't think that art is religion, but art or like an artist is a kind of some sort of visionary or like a believer, and it starts with that, and it's more about not to get involved with religion, kind of, but still remain a believer, so to say. And yeah, that's just so how I understood what you tried to say, or like.
But then at the same time, it's also including doubt in the whatever belief you want to build. You immediately include the doubt aspect also, because otherwise there wouldn't. Isn't that what like artistic practice is as well?
I think that one of the things that is difficult in describing, what you're doing as an artist, is that the relationship to even what you're doing changes a lot as you're doing it, and I think that that's not mystical. Actually, it's just rather difficult to describe in retrospect. I think it's just happening, but it's a problem of. I guess my own opinion would be that there's a kind of speed that's required now of kind of putting things together. That's probably always been required. This is a problem of language, but I think language gets even more screwed up with that increase in speed of kind of transmission. So maybe that is seen as spiritual, intensified as spiritual, when it really is just kind of like, oh, well, I'm working on something.
So I know we also have time for questions from the audience, too, if there are any of you who want to pose a question, and we have a microphone. Yes.
Thank you. I wondered whether the attempt to reconcile or draw together the digital and painting realms is a fulfillable project. And I'm thinking at one extreme of someone like Ryoji Keida's recent installations or performances, which suggest to me the inevitable autoeroticization of the digital realm, as if these works require no human audience to satisfy themselves. They are about the onanistic consumption of its own material. But I think that extends to some extent also to any image that one would manipulate on a very basic level with Photoshop. So I think that there may be a continuity there of the autoerotic in the digital realm. And insofar as that is literally untouchable, those images are literally untouchable, painting moves towards a different erotics, and I might be picking up on something Ken indicated here, which always presupposes a human viewer or human subject viewing the work, and in that sense lends itself or concedes to morphologies that enable one kind of erotics or another. And that the criticisms of painting also dwell or draw on that. You know, going back to someone like Kossuth's essay in 1975, criticizing the morphological conservatism of painting, that it seems to me that there's a way in which, as painters, we would have to concede that those morphologies are inevitable and recurrent, and that perhaps on a level that we engaged with the previous panel, that we are somehow involved in a common project, particularly with abstraction, in the way that author functions emerge from Foucault's writings. We might say that, like Marxism, like Freudianism, we are engaged in some discourse around abstraction that we commonly agree is purposeful. And that, but it is, I think, fundamentally a question of different erotics.
Thank you. Anyone want to respond to that?
I actually think it's interesting that we were all invited here to talk about digital painting, and all of us it kind of retreated into talking about something else. Yeah, I think it might be to do with trying to recover, like resisting that, but not because categories suck or whatever, but because that specific category seems to, you know, it just sounds so cold.
And do you think that's particularly like a condition about now? Like, would you say that that's changed historically, or?
I think artists always kind of resist these kind of, you know, post-internet or like, you know, second generation abstract expressionist or, you know, I don't know, conceptual artists. I think there's a tendency always, right, or historically, to resist these, unless you're like, I am Dada, and like, this is Dada, and I'm doing Dada. It's both.
I wonder what Albert Oehlen would say. Because looking at the show upstairs and seeing his earlier work, the black and white paintings, the abstractions, it's really amazing, surprising how fresh and current they actually look. And I don't know how old they are. Is it 10 years old probably, or even older? And anyway, that just kind of like struck me.
Yeah, I was also, because I think the show's really beautifully curated in that it's not chronological necessarily. Yeah. Because you look, it says 97, it says 2006, it says exactly. 80, you know, it says 92, but there's a something. It's, I don't know, very.
Almost like forecasting some kind of. Yeah, it's like, personally for me, it's like hard to find like these definitions of like, in my own practice, it's all about like trying to, like it's merging, or like whether it's collaboration, or whether it's like from one medium reflecting the next medium, or reflecting to what has been done and what could be like almost like a retrospective forecast, and then or like constant like side shifting, and so then to try to define something which is so current, and we all don't know what the internet is yet, and what effect it has on ourselves, on our bodies, on our gender, and so I think that's why we're all a little bit like, why are we here? What's the panel?
I think we're all also kind of a little bit shy.
Is there another question?
Okay, so our previous panel ended with a very difficult question about defining what is abstraction. And I was really interested in how this panel began with Alexander Galloway proposing that perhaps, and defining what is the digital, because that's so much a part of this discussion. And I was interested in the proposition of the digital as being something that predates the 20th century, and that it is a process of making discrete. And I am really interested in the fact that all of the panelists have some relationship to painting, and of course painting is very much tied to the history of abstraction. But I'm curious about how each of the panelists would approach the proposition of in what way their practice or their work is related to the process of making discrete, i.e. being digital.
Or sort of how how does this making discrete appear in the work?
I think I already answered that question. I disagree with that definition of the digital, so I can't answer the question.
An adequate answer, yes.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think it's an interesting question because one way to answer it would be like, oh, there's pixels or something, right? But that's like not the way that, I don't think that's a very interesting like way to talk about digitality in art. And so, like the idea of layering. I mean, I want to hear more about that because that's a way of, it's not like showing the pixels, but it's showing the discrete phases or something. And I think that's something that the computer paintings upstairs do really well. It's about kind of like layers of style or layers of rendering styles that then get almost, very harshly kind of fused. And I think that's what makes those works so interesting. I mean, they're not really about computers, right, those paintings, or very tangentially.
You see the history of the making.
Yeah, exactly. Much more. And even to go back to the idea of translucency, which is something that painting has always been obsessed with, but you could say that a kind of classicism is about showing those, hiding the layering, right? So underpainting and et cetera, and layers of varnish and so on. But I think like the computer paintings and even, Ken, the way you deal with layering and feeding back might be a way to parse this question about
But I think
discrete.
upstairs it's also because he inserted like posters and like his own mark and like kind of imitating the computer, but then also misguiding it and like. So it's all about like this, almost like camouflage dance of, where am I as a painter? Am I here? Is this who made this painting? And so it's the layering is. It's definitely also. It's not just. I think upstairs at least. It's not in these black and white paintings. It's not just about like. Layering, it's more like tricking or something, like a trickster.
Yeah.
In a really good like a blending in, but then also obviously not. So, yeah.
The trickster as a magician.
Trickster as.
No, but the trickster as in like. The paper is like inserted into the canvas, and then the paper shows, well, this is like an assemblage or like a sample piece in there, and then there's like a white mark and then a black brush stroke, kind of imitating the computer pixel, but then also actually showing that I'm a mark of a painter. So this, I'm not really like magician style, but.
I think I just wanted to sort of interject something, but there's two different kind of thoughts about digitality. I think one is like speaking directly to technology itself, and then the other is about like mediation through language, and digital being a kind of translation of something. So for me, that's how I think about both of those modes, and then the abstraction that occurs through those two kind of things, through technology or through translation. So in a way that I think that's kind of how I think about it.
And maybe digitality is the thing that allows us, or it makes that translation really easy or something, or it forces us to confront. Yeah, I don't know, that's something that occurs to me. And I like how you mentioned in the panel about really kind of changing our historical register, right? Dealing with weaving and the idea of a stitch as a kind of a pixel, a proto-pixel. We could talk about mosaics too, which go back much earlier. Are there other questions in the back?
I just wanted to say, I hear all of you exploring how to use digital medium, just as artists in past generations explored oil painting, explored collage, And some of you might not end up using it in a totally abstract way. So all of these elements kind of relate to how artists have explored materials and the process that open. I mean, this is a huge category of possibilities. So I think to start backwards with abstraction really is somewhat of the wrong question. It's really, what are you finding out as you're exploring and using the new mediums?
I don't know if that is an answer but I think that we live in that age of the digital revolution somehow, and the main part of that revolution is yet about to kind of come, I have the feeling. So, but we're all from this kind of same generation, growing up with black and white TVs. I mean, at least I experienced those. And then being introduced to the mobile phone, to the Game Boy, to the computer, to the internet, and so on. So I think that it feels like, due to all that, it's very closely related to that Western idea or concept of progress, and to that technology, or the advancement of technology is very closely related. So we got used to that. Almost this is kind of like the thrust somehow of our approach, the Western capitalistic approach, is technology somehow, and it feels like it's equally a savior, but it's a messiah, and it's the future, and we kind of like connect a lot of, I don't know, hopes and references to it. But I think that we live in that, like I said, in that digital revolution where the most of that effects and the results of how that revolution affects us as human beings is yet about to experience or to kind of document or to. And I think that that is my there might be different like approaches or understandings or consciousness formed in the future, but at least being in that generation, experiencing or living through that shift almost, I feel like equally. I mean, I feel the fascination of the digital sphere in that revolution, and it has an incredible like gravity somehow to follow and be fascinated. But I think that because of that, we tend to forget much more basic or essential, almost necessities somehow, or like a kind of critical, I don't know, reflectory sense somehow. And just a sentence I found. Kind of, I don't know, comprising that, which I'd like to end my contribution here, is that a blank screen can serve as a mirror, which speaks about, I think, that fascination and hypnotization we experience in front of the digital sphere being represented to us mostly by a screen of some sort, and the fact that once there's no transmitting of information or images, we look at ourselves into the black iPhone screen. That's it.
I want to say something very basic, but the effect it also has on me as an artist or as a human being is I have much less time. I think that's the biggest effect it has, and it's really annoying. It's like for a painter who has a studio practice, it's, looking at your emails every morning is kind of, I mean, or at least like we all know that, like I'm supposed to answer you in the next 5 seconds? Okay, great. This like weird definition of time is like a very strange effect on your body and your mind and obviously your practice as an artist.
That was going to be my question, was the question of time, and I guess it's like from one painter to other painters, how you, because time, both in the way that you just described, but then also in terms of, I think, the definition of the digital, the one that Ken's not accepting, of making
Right,
discrete.
I just want to make it. It's very frustrating.
But what I think is interesting.
But it's a textual definition that's not visual. I mean, it's like it doesn't take into account that phenomena do change, that there are effects of things on your body, and the way the erotic is constructed, and the way people speak, and the way cultures interact. I mean, it's a purely like abstract definition. That is just kind of a pure structure. It has nothing to do with anything.
I think that's what I was going to kind of point to, because I sort of agree with you and sort of don't. What it seems is that it has somehow, this idea of making difference or making discrete has sped up. So our experience of it is what I was going to point to, is that our experience of it is in kind of increasing fluidity. Or this is what kind of blows my mind, is that everything feels increasingly fluid, increasingly natural even. There's a kind of new natural that's emerging. But in fact, it feels like it's been chopped into tiny, tiny, tiny pieces on some kind of unconscious body level or something. But actually, it's like streaming, everything's streaming. And so I was thinking, for me, trying to think about painting becomes increasingly, how do I think about time in painting? That becomes the urgent question. And so I was just wondering if others had, how you're structuring time.
Maybe to liven it up a little. I recently met someone. I was trying to tell them how I love going to bookstores, because sometimes you discover books that you've never seen before, and they're like, why don't you just order it on the internet? And I said, because that's how you find information. Like, there's something else over there, and they're like, oh, I've never done that before, right? So that experience, I guess, is that is a major difference, and I think that whatever would be called the digital is related to that experience of not knowing, this. Yeah, exactly.
And I will say the New Museum bookstore has always been the best one in downtown, except for the old St. Mark's. Yeah, other comments on this idea of temporality?
I mean, maybe. I think that thinking about time, I think generally about reflecting about the supposed or the promised possibilities of the digital realm. Time is just one of the aspects which the digital realm suggests to have overcome or somehow. I would say that, for instance, questions or questions like gender or sexuality, time and space, all of that in a way, I have the feeling at least, is suggested to be overcome or transgressed.
We're still sitting here with our bodies.
No, yeah, of course we are sitting here. But even in the digital sphere, I have the feeling it's just a proposition, but we are using the internet or the main ways of communicating and having exchange with that digital sphere in the mind of single users with our screens in front of us. So it's just a kind of illusion of that, transgress our current condition somehow. Right. I don't know what is necessary to somehow actually reach that condition or kind of be able to transgress, but I have the feeling that this current structure of the internet is not maybe specifically the World Wide Web, how it creates, connections, how it presents information, how we are forced into a certain model of behavior as users somehow is automatically denying us that possibility, plus our own attitude or consciousness towards it somehow. So it related somehow to your question involving time, I think.
I also don't think the internet is really that bad, because I love communicating with people. But I think that we have to find ways of simultaneously using it and doing other things too, not just letting it, substitute or eliminate other things. And that involves a long discussion about financial structures and the way data is cut up and blah 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 blah. But that's what we have to. If there's something to fight against, it's not the internet. It's certain aspects of the way things haven't been regulated properly in relationship to the internet, or deregulated properly in the relationship to the internet, or multiple things like that, specific subjects.
I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. People have more questions?
We should all be at the beach right now.
Great. Well, thank you all for coming, and thanks to all the panelists for such an interesting conversation.